Alright, welcome back. In the last video, we looked at the impact of climate change and the impact that one could have on climate change by choosing to have one fewer child. And so we're going to now think about slowing the rate of population growth. Just what kind of an impact could that have? Could slowing the rate of population growth have on global emissions? Well, getting fertility rates to match the UN's low fertility projections rather than the medium fertility projections, which corresponds to an average difference of 0.5 children per woman, 0.5 fewer children per woman, would likely result in a yearly reduction of greenhouse gas emissions of 5.1 billion tons of CO2 by 2100. 5.1 billion tons per year. In 2014, humans emitted 10.7 billion tons total. So about half of what we emitted in 2014 could be saved in each year from 2100 on by reducing the number of children we have by 0.5 children per woman. It's as large as or larger than the savings from doubling fuel efficiency on cars, increasing wind energy usage 50-fold, or tripling nuclear energy. So it's a pretty significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over the course of this century. It could, in fact, account for about 1/5 of the reductions required by 2050 in order to shift us from the 2-degree path to the 1.5-degree path. We could save between 16% and 29% of the required emission reductions by shifting to the low fertility projection. And just to give us a sense of what that means, fertility rates in 2019 are about 2.4 births per woman. So we would need to reduce that to about 1.9 births per woman. In the US, that would mean lowering fertility rates to about 1.2 births per woman, which is fairly low, to be perfectly honest. It is below the population replacement rate. It means that we would be fueling our economy not by growing our domestic population, but by using more and more labor from immigrant sources. We would have to increase immigration in order to maintain our economy at that low of a fertility rate. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. In less developed countries, in global south countries, we see the fertility rates are much higher. In Niger, 7.0, in Chad, 6.0, in the DRC, 6.0, and we see that in other highly developed countries, it is much lower. South Korea, it's at just 1, Singapore, 1.1, and Taiwan, 1.1. So the reduction of 0.5 children per woman would not be evenly distributed, but it would have a greater impact if that reduction happened in more advanced countries, if it happened in more developed countries than it happened in less developed countries. And it's worth keeping that fact in mind. So how could we do that? Well, we looked this week at a paper by Hickey, Reeder, and Earl, and Hickey, Reeder, and Earl, which I'll refer to as HRC, propose forms of population engineering in order to reduce the fertility rate globally. When we think of population engineering, we tend to think of coercion. We tend to think that it's a bad, dangerous, scary thing. We tend to think of authoritarian governments telling people who can have children, when they can have children, how many children they can have, and telling others that they cannot ever have children. So we tend to think of things like Nazi eugenics. We tend to think of things like China's one-child policy. We tend to think of things like forced sterilization, which, it's worth remembering, has happened in the United States, happened for a long time in the United States through federally funded programs in 32 U.S. states. There were over 60,000 operations performed, forcing women to be sterilized. More than 20,000 were performed in California alone, and those programs operated between 1909 and 1978. And all of them targeted undesirable populations. They targeted immigrants, they targeted the mentally ill, they targeted unmarried mothers, they targeted people of color, disabled people, and poor people. These shameful policies of forced sterilization were an assault on individual autonomy. These women were not given a choice. They were not able to consent to the operations that were performed on them. They had no choice in this matter. These are the kinds of policies we must avoid. Coercion seems never to be permissible in such situations because it is always a violation of autonomy. It is always a violation of an individual's right to choose for themselves what kind of life they will live. But can we do population engineering without coercion? Well, it seems that, in fact, we can. There are choice-enhancing interventions that are available to us. We can, for example, improve family planning services and education. We can make contraceptives more readily available. We can educate men on the dangers of childbearing, and this has been shown to be quite effective in societies where men push women to be more reproductive. We can educate women more generally, as greater education correlates with lower fertility rates. We can foster economic development, as economic development also correlates with lower fertility rates. And we can foster gender justice, as countries where the inequalities between men and women are lessened tend to be countries with lower fertility rates. These sorts of choice-enhancing interventions have been shown to be incredibly effective in the MENA countries, that is, the Middle East and North African countries, where fertility rates have reduced from about 7 births per woman to about 3 births per woman from 1960 to 2006, mostly on the basis of choice-enhancing interventions, economic development, education, and improvement of family planning services. These are often thought of as autonomy-enhancing rather than autonomy-restricting interventions. They enhance an individual's ability to make choices for themselves by ensuring access to basic goods. If they are more economically self-sufficient, women are less likely to feel pressured or to be pressured to have more children. And they are more economically self-sufficient if they are better educated and have access to family planning services. These kinds of interventions seem not only permissible but obligatory. It seems that we ought to provide these sorts of resources to women globally, and if they lower fertility rates, that seems to be an added bonus. Can we possibly move beyond choice enhancement? HRC give us this nice little graphic to help us think through the choices that are available to us. At the right end of the arrow, we see a high risk of coercion with coercive policies like a one-child policy or eugenics-type policies. At the left-hand side of the arrow, we see policies with very low risk of coercion, choice enhancement policies. Are there interventions that are more coercive than choice enhancement or more risky than choice enhancement, but still morally permissible? This is the question that we now need to address. The question brings us up against the idea of procreative liberty. Procreative liberty is the right to responsibly choose the number and spacing of one's children without interference. It's recognized in most major human rights doctrines and in the constitutions of many nations as a foundational right. This is something that governments ought not to interfere with. Would a move beyond choice enhancement infringe upon procreative liberty? Well, maybe, but maybe not. Rights are always limited in scope. No right is absolute and capacious. Rights always have some limitations. We recognize that there are limitations on what even the right to life demands of us. It doesn't require that we provide everything that is necessary in order for one to live, even if it would be costly, impose heavy costs on ourselves. Moreover, we already interfere with procreative liberty in pronatalist ways. We think that it is acceptable, for example, for the government to encourage people to have more children by offering income tax credits, by offering other sorts of incentives through the tax code to have more children. We also live in a heavily pronatalist society where much of the media portrays large families as the ideal, where religions portray large families as the ideal, where one's own family imposes pressure on individuals to reproduce, to have grandbabies. We also intervene in individual cases when the well-being of children is at stake or the costs to society are deemed too high. We try to discourage, for example, welfare recipients from having more children. So we do engage in policies that go beyond choice enhancement, and we think that those, in fact, do not restrict procreative liberty. So what kinds of policies might be available to us if we can go beyond choice enhancement? Well, preference adjusting policies are one set that HRC look at. These are policies that use what we've called nudges to move people to make choices they might not otherwise have made. The idea of a nudge comes from Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, who are behavioral economists, psychologists, who argue for a kind of libertarian paternalism. They say that we recognize that folks are liable to make choices that they would not reflectively judge to be in their best interest. We all are liable to make such choices. So we engineer choice situations so that these folks will be more likely to make the better choice. People in these choice situations are still free to choose, but we've made it more likely that they will choose more wisely. William Ryerson has claimed, for example, that in terms of birth averted per dollar spent, mass media communications are probably the most effective strategy for reducing fertility rates. He estimates that a mere $35 million per year could fund persuasive and motivationally effective programming in all major developing countries of the world. What the idea of preference adjustment is to create the perception among individuals that the thing to do is to have fewer children. This is what we prefer to do, and such a perception is created by creating a media atmosphere, a social media atmosphere, an entertainment atmosphere within which smaller families are portrayed as the ideal. It's also created by nudging folks towards having fewer children, by making it, in some cases, slightly less socially acceptable to have more, by making it slightly more difficult to navigate social situations if one has more. These are preference adjusting policies. We might worry, though, and we'll talk about this when we have our discussion, whether such preference-adjusting policies amount to a kind of psychological manipulation. Aren't we just messing with people's heads when we do this? We might also worry whether they undermine individual autonomy by tricking individuals into a choice they wouldn't have otherwise made. This seems a deep and troubling concern, something we need to spend some time thinking about. The next step is incentivizing policies. These go a step beyond mere preference adjustment. They're more direct interventions that shape the choice, that shape one's choice environment by offering inducements or threatening punishments for conforming or failing to conform to the desired behavior. So here we might think of things like positive incentives in the form of tax credits or direct payments for families that choose to have fewer children, or negative incentives, punishments, in the form of tax penalties or fines for families that choose to have more children. This would discourage reproduction by making it more costly, either because one would have to forego certain positive incentives or would suffer certain punishments for choosing to have more children. So I want to stop there and ask some questions, offer some thoughts for discussion that we might want to address when we come together on Thursday. The first question is, will these policies burden some people more than others? Will they have a disparate effect on different groups of people? Who and why who might they burden more heavily, and why might those folks suffer a greater burden? We also might wonder if it's problematic that they do. We also might want to ask whether they're likely to advantage or privilege some groups of individuals within a society. This is something that Kukla explores in her response to HRC, and it's worth taking seriously. We also might wonder whether they're likely to affect social norms in troubling ways, another question that Kukla raises that we'll explore in our discussion. We also might wonder whether they're likely to be effective in changing behavior of people whose behavior most needs to change. We noted at the outset that though the wealthiest 10% of individuals within the wealthiest countries account for the lion's share of carbon emissions, they might not feel the pressure of many of these policies that we've discussed. And that we might think is problematic. And finally, we might wonder whether they're necessary. We might wonder whether this is going too far, whether there might be more effective or more acceptable or permissible ways to address the existential threat of climate change. So these are the questions I want to leave you with until we come together on Thursday. Take care.